Hello guys, welcome to today's video. In this episode, we're going to learn about the apartheid in South Africa and how 21,000 people died during this regime. Stay tuned and let's get started. What was apartheid? Translated from the Afrikaans meaning apartness, was introduced in South Africa in 1948. Apartheid was the ideology supported by the National Party (NP) government. On paper, it appeared to call for equal development and freedom of cultural expression, but the way it was implemented made this impossible. Apartheid made laws force the different racial groups to live separately and develop separately, and grossly unequally too. It tried to stop all intermarriage and social integration between racial groups. During apartheid, to have a friendship with someone of a different race. Apartheid was a social system which severely disadvantaged the majority of the population simply because they did not share the skin color of the rulers. Many were kept just above destitution because they were non-white. In basic principles, apartheid did not differ that much from the policy of segregation of the South African governments existing before the Afrikaner Nationalist Party. Apartheid cruelly and forcibly separated people and had a fearsome state apparatus to punish those who disagreed. Another reason why apartheid was seen as much worse than segregation was that apartheid was introduced in a period when other countries were moving away from racist policies. Before World War II, the Western world was not as critical of racial discrimination, and Africa was colonized in this period. The Second World War highlighted the problems of racism, making the world turn away from such policies and encouraging demands for decolonization. It was during this period that South Africa introduced the more rigid racial policy of apartheid. People often wonder why such a policy was introduced and why it had so much support. Various reasons can be given for apartheid, although they are all closely linked. The main reasons lie in ideas of racial superiority and fear. Across the world, racism is influenced by the idea that one race must be superior to another. Such ideas are found in all population groups. The other main reason for apartheid was fear, as in South Africa the white people are in the minority, and many were worried they would lose their jobs, culture, and language. This is obviously not a justification for apartheid, but explains how people were thinking. Called for the separate development of the different racial groups in South Africa. Apartheid laws. Numerous laws were passed in the creation of the apartheid state. Here are a few of the pillars on which it rested. Population Registration Act, 1950. This act demanded that people be registered according to their racial group. This meant that the Department of Home Affairs would have a record of people according to whether they were white, colored, black, Indian, or Asian. People would then be treated differently according, and this caused some problems. Group Areas Act, 1950. This was the act that started physical separation between races, especially in urban areas. The act also called for the removal of some groups of people into areas set aside for their racial group. Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, 1959. This act said that different racial groups had to live in different areas. Only a small percentage of South Africa was left for black people, who comprised the vast majority, to form their homelands. This act also got rid of black spots inside white areas by moving all black people out of the city. Well-known removals were those in District 6, Sophiatown, and Lady Selborne. These black people were then placed in townships outside of the town. They could not own property here, only rent it, as the land could only be white-owned. This act caused much hardship and resentment. People lost their homes, were moved off land they had owned for many years, and were moved to undeveloped areas far away from their place of work. Some other important laws were the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, 1949, Immorality Amendment Act, 1950, Separate Representation of Voters Act, 1951. Resistance before 1960. Resistance to apartheid came from all circles, and not only, as is often presumed, from those who suffered the negative effects of discrimination. Criticism also came from other countries, and some of these gave support to the South African freedom movements. Some of the most important organizations involved in the struggle for liberation were the African National Congress, ANC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, the Black Consciousness Movement, BCM, and the United Democratic Front, UDF. There were also Indian and colored, organized resistance movements, e.g. the Natal Indian Congress, NIC, the Colored People's Organization, white organized groups, e.g. the Radical Armed Resistance Movement, ARM, and Black Sash, and church-based groups, the Christian Institute. We shall consider the ANC. The ANC was formed in Bloemfontein in 1912, soon after the Union of South Africa. Originally, it was called the South African Native National Congress, SANNC. It was started as a movement for the black elite, that is, those blacks who were educated. In 1919, the ANC sent a deputation to London to plead for a new deal for South African blacks, but there was no change to their position. The history of resistance by the ANC goes through 3 phases. The first was dialogue and petition, the second direct opposition, and the last the period of exiled armed struggle. In 1949, just after apartheid was introduced, the ANC started on a more militant path, with the Youth League playing a more important role. The ANC introduced their program of action in 1949, supporting strike action, protests, and other forms of nonviolent resistance. Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu started to play an important role in the ANC in this period. In 1952, the ANC started the Defiance Campaign. This campaign called on people to purposefully break apartheid laws and offer themselves for arrest. It was hoped that the increase in prisoners would cause the system to collapse and get international support for the ANC. Black people got onto white buses, used white toilets, entered into white areas, and refused to use passes. Despite 8,000 people ending up in jail, the ANC caused no threat to the apartheid regime. The ANC continued along the same path during the rest of the 1950s until in 1959, some members broke away and formed the PAC. These members wanted to follow a more violent and militant route and felt that success could not be reached through the ANC's method. Final years of apartheid. In 1974, resistance to apartheid was encouraged by Portuguese withdrawal from Mozambique and Angola. After the 1974 Carnation Revolution, South African troops withdrew from Angola early in 1976, failing to prevent the MPLA from gaining power there, and black students in South Africa celebrated the Malabatini Declaration of Faith, signed by Mangosuthu Buthelezi and Harry Schwartz in 1974, enshrined the principles of peaceful transition of power and equality for all. Its purpose was to provide a blueprint for South Africa by consent and racial peace in a multiracial society, stressing opportunity for all, consultation, the federal concept, and a Bill of Rights. It caused a split in the United Party that ultimately realigned oppositional politics. In South Africa, with the formation of the Progressive Federal Party in 1977. The declaration was the first of several such joint agreements by acknowledged black and white political leaders in South Africa. In 1978, the National Party Defense Minister, Peter Willem Botha, became Prime Minister. His white minority regime worried about Soviet aid to revolutionaries in South Africa at the same time that South African economic growth had slowed. The South African government noted that it was spending too much money to maintain segregated homelands created for blacks, and the homelands were proving to be uneconomical. Nor was maintaining blacks as third-class citizens working well. Black labor remained vital to the economy, and illegal black labor unions were flourishing. Many blacks remained too poor to contribute significantly to the economy through their purchasing power. Although they composed more than 70% of the population, Botha's regime feared that an antidote was needed to prevent the blacks being attracted to communism. In July 1979, the Nigerian government alleged that the Shell BP, Petroleum Development Company of Nigeria Limited, SBDC, was selling Nigerian oil to South Africa, though there was little evidence or commercial logic for such sales. The alleged sanctions breaking was used to justify the seizure of some of BP's assets in Nigeria, including their stake in SBDC, although it appears the real reasons were economic nationalism and domestic politics ahead of the Nigerian elections. Many South Africans attended schools in Nigeria, and Nelson Mandela acknowledged the role of Nigeria in the struggle against apartheid on several occasions. In the early 1980s, Bota's National Party government started to recognize the inevitability of the need to reform the apartheid system. Early reforms were driven by a combination of internal violence, international condemnation, changes within the National Party's constituency, and changing demographics. Whites constituted only 16% of the total population, in comparison to 20% 50 years earlier. In 1983, a new constitution was passed implementing what was called the tricameral parliament, giving coloreds and Indians voting rights and parliamentary representation in separate houses. The House of Assembly, 178 members, 4 whites. The House of Representatives, 85 members, 4 coloreds, and the House of Delegates, 45 members, 4 Indians. Each house handled laws pertaining to its racial group's own affairs, including health, education, and other community issues. All laws relating to general affairs, matters such as defense, industry, taxation, and black affairs, were handled by a cabinet made up of representatives from all 3 houses. However, the White Chamber had a large majority on this cabinet, ensuring that effective control of the country remained in the hands of the white minority. Blacks, although making up the majority of the population, were excluded from representation. They remained nominal citizens of their homelands. The first tricameral elections were largely boycotted by colored and Indian voters, amid widespread rioting. Concerned over the popularity of Mandela, Botha denounced him as an arch-Marxist committed to violent revolution, but to appease black opinion and nurture Mandela as a benevolent leader of blacks, the government transferred him from the maximum security Robben Island to the lower security Pollsmoor prison just outside Cape Town, where prison life was more comfortable for him. The government allowed Mandela more visitors, including visits and interviews by foreigners, to let the world know that he was being treated well. Black homelands were declared nation-states and past laws were abolished. Black labor unions were legitimized. The government recognized the right of blacks to live in urban areas permanently and gave blacks property rights there. Interest was expressed in rescinding the law against interracial marriage and also rescinding the law against sexual relations between different races, which was under ridicule abroad. The spending for black schools increased to 1/7 of what was spent per white child, up from 1/16 in 1968. At the same time, attention was given to strengthening the effectiveness of the police apparatus. In January 1985, Botha addressed the government's House of Assembly and stated that the government was willing to release Mandela on condition that Mandela pledge opposition to acts of violence to further political objectives. Mandela's reply was read in public by his daughter Zinzi, his first words, distributed publicly since his sentence to prison 21 years earlier. Mandela described violence as the responsibility of the apartheid regime and said that with democracy there would be no need for violence. The crowd listening to the reading of his speech erupted in cheers and chants. This response helped to further elevate Mandela's status in the eyes of those, both internationally and domestically, who opposed apartheid. Between 1986 and 1988, some petty apartheid laws were repealed, along with the past laws. Botha told white South Africans to adapt or die, and twice he wavered on the eve of what were billed as Rubicon announcements of substantial reforms, although on both occasions he backed away from substantial changes. Ironically, these reforms served only to trigger intensified political violence through the remainder of the 1980s as more communities and political groups across the country joined the resistance movement. Botha's government stopped short of substantial reforms, such as lifting the ban on the ANC, PAC and SACP and other liberation organizations, releasing political prisoners, or repealing the foundation laws of Grand Apartheid. The government's stance was that they would not contemplate negotiating until those organizations renounced violence. By 1987, South Africa's economy was growing at one of the lowest rates in the world, and the ban on South African Participation in international sporting events was frustrating many whites. In South Africa, examples of African states with black leaders and white minorities existed in Kenya and Zimbabwe. Whispers of South Africa, one day having a black president, sent more hardline whites into supporting right-wing political parties. Mandela was moved to a four-bedroom house of his own, with a swimming pool and shaded by fir trees, on a prison farm just outside of Cape Town. He had an unpublicized meeting with Botha. Botha impressed Mandela by walking forward, extending his hand and pouring Mandela's tea. The two had a friendly discussion, with Mandela comparing the African National Congress's rebellion with that of the Afrikaner rebellion and talking about everyone being brothers. A number of clandestine meetings were held between the ANC in exile and various sectors of the internal struggle, such as women and educationalists. More overtly, a group of white intellectuals met the ANC in Senegal for talks known as the Dakar Conference. Early in 1989, Botha had a stroke. He was prevailed upon to resign in February 1989. He was succeeded as president later that year by F.W. de Klerk. Despite his initial reputation as a conservative, de Klerk moved decisively towards negotiations to end the political stalemate in the country. Prior to his term in office, F.W. de Klerk had already experienced political success as a result of the power base he had built in the Transvaal. During this time, F.W. de Klerk served as chairman to the Provincial National Party, which was in favor of the apartheid regime. The transition of de Klerk's ideology regarding apartheid is seen clearly in his opening address to Parliament on February 2, 1990. F.W. de Klerk announced that he would repeal discriminatory laws and lift the 30-year ban on leading anti-apartheid groups such as the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, SACP, and the United Democratic Front. The Land Act was brought to an end. F.W. de Klerk also made his first public commitment to release Nelson Mandela, to return to press freedom, and to suspend the death penalty. Media restrictions were lifted, and political prisoners not guilty of common law crimes were released. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from Victor Verster prison after more than 27 years behind bars, having been instructed by the UN Security Council to end its long-standing involvement in Southwest Africa/Namibia, and in the face of military stalemate in southern Angola, and an escalation in the size and cost of the combat with the Cubans, the Angolans and SWAPO forces, and the growing cost of the border war, South Africa negotiated a change of control. Namibia became independent on March 21, 1990. Apartheid was dismantled in a series of negotiations from 1990 to 1991, culminating in a transitional period, which resulted in the country's 1994 general election, the first in South Africa held with universal suffrage. In 1990, negotiations were earnestly begun, with two meetings between the government and the ANC. The purpose of the negotiations was to pave the way for talks towards a peaceful transition towards majority rule. These meetings were successful in laying down the preconditions for negotiations, despite the considerable tensions still abounding within the country. Apartheid legislation was abolished in 1991. At the first meeting, the NP and ANC discussed the conditions for negotiations to begin. The meeting was held at Groot Schuur, the president's official residence. They released the Groot Schuur Minute, which said that before negotiations commenced, political prisoners would be freed and all exiles allowed to return. There were fears that the change of power would be violent. To avoid this, it was essential that a peaceful resolution between all parties be reached. In December 1991, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA, began negotiations on the formation of a multiracial, transitional government and a new constitution, extending political rights to all groups. CODESA adopted a declaration of intent and committed itself to an undivided South Africa. Reforms and negotiations to end apartheid led to a backlash among the right-wing white opposition, leading to the Conservative Party winning a number of by-elections against NP candidates. De Klerk responded by calling a whites-only referendum in March 1992 to decide whether negotiations should continue. 68% voted in favor, and the victory instilled in de Klerk and the government a lot more confidence, giving the NP a stronger position in negotiations. When negotiations resumed in May 1992, under the tag of Codesa II, stronger demands were made. The ANC and the government could not reach a compromise on how power should be shared during the transition to democracy. The NP wanted to retain a strong position in a transitional government and the power to change decisions made by Parliament. Persistent violence added to the tension during the negotiations. This was due mostly to the intense rivalry between the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, and the ANC and the eruption of some traditional, tribal, and local rivalries between the Zulu and Xhosa historical tribal affinities, especially in the southern Natal provinces. Although Mandela and Buthelezi met to settle their differences, they could not stem the violence. One of the worst cases of ANC-IFP violence was the Boypating massacre of June 17, 1992, when 200 IFP militants attacked the Gauteng township of Boypating, killing 45. Witnesses said that the men had arrived in police vehicles, supporting claims that elements within the police and army contributed to the ongoing violence. Subsequent judicial inquiries found the evidence of the witnesses to be unreliable or discredited, and that there was no evidence of National Party or police involvement in the massacre. When de Klerk visited the scene of the incident, he was initially warmly welcomed, but he was suddenly confronted by a crowd of protesters brandishing stones and placards. The motorcade sped from the scene as police tried to hold back the crowd. Shots were fired by the police, and the PAC stated that 3 of its supporters had been gunned down. Nonetheless, the Boypating massacre offered the ANC a pretext to engage in brinkmanship. Mandela argued that de Klerk, as head of state, was responsible for bringing an end to the bloodshed. He also accused the South African police of inciting the ANC-IFP violence. This formed the basis for ANC's withdrawal from the negotiations, and the Codesa Forum broke down completely at this stage. The Bisho massacre on September 7, 1992 brought matters to a head. The Ciskei Defense Force killed 29 people and injured 200 when they opened fire on ANC marchers, demanding the reincorporation of the Ciskei homeland into South Africa. In the aftermath, Mandela and de Klerk agreed to meet to find ways to end the spiraling violence. This led to a resumption of negotiations. Right-wing violence also added to the hostilities of this period. The assassination of Chris Hani on April 10, 1993, threatened to plunge the country into chaos. Hani, the popular General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, SACP, was assassinated in 1993 in Dawn Park in Johannesburg by Janusz Walus, an anti-communist Polish refugee who had close links to the white nationalist Afrikaner, were Stansbeweging, AWB. Hani enjoyed widespread support beyond his constituency in the SACP and ANC, and had been recognized as a potential successor to Mandela. His death brought forth protests throughout the country and across the international community, but ultimately proved a turning point, after which the main parties pushed for a settlement with increased determination. On June 25, 1993, the AWB used an armored vehicle to crash through the doors of the Kempton Park World Trade Center, where talks were still going ahead under the Negotiating Council, though this did not derail the process. In addition to the continuing black-on-black violence, there were a number of attacks on white civilians by the PAC's military wing, the Azanian People's Liberation Army, APLA. The PAC was hoping to strengthen their standing by attracting the support of the angry, impatient youth. In the St. James Church massacre on July 25, 1993, members of the APLA opened fire in a church in Cape Town, killing 11 members of the congregation and wounding 58. In 1993, de Klerk and Mandela were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their work for the peaceful termination of the apartheid regime and for laying the foundations for a new democratic South Africa. Violence persisted right up to the 1994 general election. Lucas Mangope, leader of the Bophuthatswana homeland, declared that it would not take part in the elections. It had been decided that, once the temporary constitution had come into effect, the homelands would be incorporated into South Africa. But Mangope did not want this to happen. There were strong protests against his decision, leading to a coup d'état in Bophuthatswana carried out by the SDF. On March 10th that deposed Mangope. A WB militants attempted to intervene in hopes of maintaining Mangope in power. Fighting alongside black paramilitaries loyal to Mangope, they were unsuccessful, with 3 AWB militants being killed during this intervention, and harrowing images of the bloodshed, shown on national television and in newspapers across the world. 2 days before the election, a car bomb exploded in Johannesburg, killing 9 people. The day before the elections, another one went off, injuring 13. At midnight on 26 to 27 April 1994, the previous orange-white-blue flag adopted in 1928 was lowered, and the old, now co-official, national anthem Die Stem, The Call, was sung, followed by the raising of the new Y-shaped flag and singing of the other co-official anthem, Nkosi Cyclo I Africa, God Bless Africa, since 2019, publicly displaying the 1928 to 1994 flag in South Africa is banned. Election was held on April 27, 1994, and went off peacefully throughout the country as 20 million South Africans cast their votes. There was some difficulty in organizing the voting in rural areas, but people waited patiently for many hours to vote, amidst a palpable feeling of goodwill. An extra day was added to give everyone the chance. International observers agreed that the elections were free and fair. The European Union's report on the election, compiled at the end of May 1994, published 2 years after the election, criticized the Independent Electoral Commission's lack of preparedness for the polls, the shortages of voting materials at many voting stations, and the absence of effective safeguards against fraud in the counting process. In particular, it expressed disquiet that no international observers had been allowed to be present at the crucial stage of the count when party representatives negotiated over disputed ballots. This meant that both the electorate and the world were simply left to guess at the way the final result was achieved. The ANC won 62.65% of the vote, less than the 66.7% that would have allowed it to rewrite the Constitution. 252 of the 400 seats went to members of the African National Congress. The NP captured most of the white and colored votes and became the official opposition party. As well as deciding the national government, the election decided the provincial governments, and the ANC won in 7 of the 9 provinces, with the NP winning in the Western Cape and the IFB in KwaZulu-Natal. On May 10, 1994, Mandela was sworn in as the new president of South Africa. The Government of National Unity was established. Its cabinet made up of 12 ANC representatives, 6 from the NP and 3 from the IFB. Thabo Mbeki and de Klerk were made deputy presidents. The anniversary of the elections, April 27th, is celebrated as a public holiday known as Freedom Day. If you are thinking of visiting Africa, make sure you visit South Africa, experience their traditions, culture, and historical sites. Thanks for watching today's episode. Kindly like, comment, share, and subscribe for more videos on this channel. See you soon.